Hi. I'm glad we woke you all up. Seriously, thank you for coming out. It's a gorgeous day. We are here to talk about the changes in wireless microphones and what's happening. I'm just going to sort of go over a little bit about today. I'm going to attempt to do an introduction and an overview of where we've come from and where we're going. And then we have, very happy and grateful to have manufacturers. We have Howard Kaufman from Lectrosonics, Ben from Shure, Colleen from Zaxcom. And then we'll do your questions and answers and a breakout session. So yeah, and if during any of the presentations you guys have any questions, if we're going too fast, too slow, stop. Well, this is really for me in particular, stop me and just ask me. All right, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so for my presentation, I wanted to go over a couple of things. You know, first of all, just some background. You know, what is the FCC? Review some terminology. Talk about the golden age of wireless mic usage, which is not so long ago. We'll talk about this, you know, how we got here in terms of the 700 megahertz reallocation. Talk about licensed versus unlicensed wireless mic usage, and whitespace devices, and then, of course, the current repack situation that we're in, and some strategies going forward. I've asked all of the manufacturers to chime in, you know, during this presentation because it's a lot of stuff and it's really dense. And I think it's very difficult for, you know, one person to know it all. So I'm happy that they're willing to share their knowledge. All right, so let's go over some terms just so we're all on the same page. I will say, and we all will say, wireless mics, but as far as the FCC is concerned, you know, it's handheld body packs, it's intercom systems, it's RPUs, reverse pickups, it's in-ear monitors and IFB systems. To the FCC, this is all sort of the same stuff. And it all operates, and this is really, I'm sorry for this high school physics, maybe even middle school physics, but it all operates in the electromagnetic spectrum. And you can see that sort of goes from radio waves, like short waves, all the way through past light. For me, the thing I'd like you to take away from this chart is the higher the frequency, the shorter the wavelength. And that'll come up as we talk about different technologies going forward. So what is the role of the FCC? They are an agency that was created by an act of Congress to manage the spectrum. Spectrum is treated like a natural resource, and so in some ways it's a lot like land management. They are charged with making sure that it is available for all interests. It's interesting, you know, it's available for all interests, but there is a strong sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's really, it's balancing economic interests as much as it is with the ability for us to use it, with sort of economic versus free speech interests. And we see that playing out, we saw it play out with the 700 megahertz and the 600 megahertz transition. So when we talk about how they sort of divide up the spectrum, this is the RF spectrum completely. There's not going to be a test on this, don't worry. And you know, this just shows all of the frequencies that, this is really sort of the parent agency, the NTIA, but it's the FCC's allocation as well. The area of interest for us are just these sort of two horizontal bands here, which is where wireless mics predominantly operate in, VHF and UHF. Everybody with me so far? All right. So the frequencies that are frequencies that are traditionally used by for wireless mics, you know, this goes back a long way, but 30 to 45 megahertz. This was before my time. And then VHF 174 to 216, UHF 470 to 960, and then somewhat recently 2.4 gig. You know, we started to see some wireless mics there. This is expanding, of course, going forward. Some of the advantages and disadvantages, you know, obviously the longer the wavelength, the lower frequency, the longer the wavelength. So these very low frequencies, particularly high frequency in VHF, the antennas are quite long. How many people, just curious, remember VHF radio mics where the antenna had to have a rubber band?
Yeah.
All right, so that's, yeah. Anyways, so that's some of the disadvantages. VHF does have good wave propagation. UHF has better wave propagation, and of course with the higher frequency comes the shorter wavelength in UHF, so better antennas. 2.4 gig and other ISM bands, you know, those are shared with Wi-Fi. You know, I don't know, I don't want to single out ZaxNet, but when ZaxNet is in use, you hear producers say, how come my Wi-Fi doesn't work? The opposite can also happen with 2.4 gig. Yeah, it's completely shared and unlicensed, or regulated but unlicensed. And we tend to operate wireless mics in what's called whitespace, which is the space between UHF TV channels. So that is the ideal place to operate a wireless mics. Again, do you remember analog stations and operating wireless mics in analog stations? That of course is ancient history. And so here are the bands as it stands now. VHF, UHF, there's 900 megahertz, which includes multiple bands within there, 1.9 gig and 2.4 gig. That's, I would say that's as of maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
The only thing missing there would be 944 to 952.
As a special band within 944, yes, the STL band, that's right. And also missing here, which we get into later, is the ultra-wide band, which is very, very short wavelengths. So UHF is what is considered beachfront property. This is sort of why it's we're able to use less and less of it. Excellent wave propagation, operates with small antennas, travels through foliage well, less susceptible to electronic noise. Yeah, this is really the beachfront property. And you know, there's an excellent balance between transmission range and output power in the UHF spectrum. So you know, it's important to know it's desirable for us and for the other economic interests. So pre-2017, you know, we had the digital switchover of 2010, where we lost 700 megahertz. And we also, it's the first time we started hearing about white space devices. White space devices we don't see too much of, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. But it was the first mention that these other uses of the white space besides wireless mics might be able to be used for data. It's also where the FCC started to really establish this idea of a licensed group of users, and that those licensed users had certain privileges that unlicensed users don't have. So as a licensed Part 74 user, and just out of curiosity, how many here have a Part 74 license? Good. I hope by the end of our presentations that we convince you to go get one immediately. But we will do a future workshop on how to get one. You have priority over unlicensed operators and operation. The FCC said you can operate at a higher RF output power, and you can reserve channels in the whitespace database system, whitespace device database system. So one of the things that the FCC started to talk about with these whitespace devices is that they can operate in the same spectrum that you and I operate wireless microphones in, but that they had to check into a database before they operated. Now these rules are changing a little bit, but by having a Part 74 license, you're able to take priority in that database. Unlicensed users, on the other hand, are limited in RF output power, and they are considered a secondary user of that spectrum, so they have no recourse. They have to accept interference. So it's very, very important to get a license. So who can get a license? Previously, it was basically broadcasters and cable TV operators, and this sort of nebulous term of film and TV producers. I think even in the rules, I remember it saying motion picture producers, which was this lovely antiquated term. I think one of the things, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the sense I got was YouTube kind of changed the FCC's perception of who is a producer. I mean, forget about motion pictures, but if I can broadcast on the internet and YouTube, then aren't I a motion picture producer by that definition? And so you started to see this sort of eligibility and this interpretation of eligibility widen a bit. Sound companies and venues that routinely use 50 mics or more are eligible. So that includes us, and certainly I would argue that those customers that rent through us and a company that has a Part 74 license would be covered under that Part 74 license. So that becomes a kind of important competitive advantage, both for you and for us.
But that says routinely using 50 as opposed to owning 50. Like, I might own 50, but I don't use 50.
Right. I think you are by definition a content producer. I think so. And Steve, first of all, I'm going to repeat the question just so people on live stream can hear it. You said, yeah, you own 50 mics, but you regularly use mics. I am not an expert in FCC law by any means, but I would argue that as a content producer, as a motion picture producer, and somebody that facilitates motion picture, and I just like saying that term, production, that you are eligible.
For a license.
For a license. It doesn't mean you don't have any of the privileges of a license until you apply for one. And yeah, that's a whole, that is literally a topic for a workshop that we'll do. And they're going to expand eligibility. Obviously, Broadway, like by these definitions that we've said, Broadway and major churches, and even not so major religious institutions aren't eligible. And so the FCC is considering expanding eligibility to include them as well. Any questions, any comments, any concerns? All right, is this sort of like what you were hoping to hear? I mean, in terms of like content? All right, good.
So the change being that now, if you use 50 mics or more, you don't need a license to be protected. But in the future, that type of protection will require a license.
Right, right. Yeah.
Would licenses be transferable? So for instance, if you, Gotham Sound, owned licenses and we wanted to go out and use a whole bunch of microphones, would you be able to transfer that information, that license to us as a renter?
No. If you rented the microphones from us and we were involved in the coordination, then yes. But if you're if you're a casual customer, and again, I'm sorry, the question was you know, can somebody that has a relationship with a house like Gotham Sound get the license transferred to them so that they have all the privileges of being a license holder, not without some specific, I think, rental or something around a specific event where we were coordinating it and you were our customer. In other words, and again, I don't want to go out too far on a limb, but just by buying a system from us doesn't grant you the ability to use our license or us to grant those privileges to you. It has to be around an event that where we as the renter, as the equipment provider, have some role in. So you should get a license. It's not that expensive. No, but
I'm just looking for ways that, you know, that maybe you can be involved with that.
Yeah, I think the best thing is we can sit everybody down that wants to and literally go through the paperwork to apply. I think that's the most important thing. It's not expensive, and it covers you for 10 years. It's just tedious to do it on your own. You know, I think there's the cost of getting the registration. It's under $200, $250.
But by this definition, it's saying right now we still can't get, because none of us have 50. Because you're saying in the future they expand it, so in the future we might be eligible.
You know, right now you guys would qualify, I believe, as motion picture producers.
Producers. Okay.
Yep. And even if you don't like get to sit in the fancy chair, and you know, even though you're the ones that hand out Comtex, you're facilitating the production enough to qualify under those rules.
Okay. So we follow under the first line.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. All right. The other thing to talk about are white space devices. So it's still a little unclear what exactly white space devices are. They're devices that operate in the white space of UHF TV stations, just like we do, but they facilitate some kind of broadband access. So what does that look like? You know, rural broadband internet, and that's where we've seen you know, a primary use of these white space devices is to get broadband to you know, very rural areas where it's hard to run cable to. We see it in so-called metro broadband, which I you know, feel like are campuses. You know, so like a college campus or a corporate campus. Something where it's more robust than a typical Wi-Fi router. Again, you know, these operate at these desirable frequencies, and so they can penetrate building structures a little bit more. I can't imagine we'll see them in consumer electronics. That was once a thought, but I don't think that that's a thought anymore. And we'll see what other white space devices come about. As you know, there are some built-in protections that the white space devices have to check into a database. There were going to be some reserved channels that they couldn't use. That's unfortunately gone away in the latest rulemaking. You know, instead we get this duplex gap, which I go into when we talk about 600 megahertz. White space devices have to check in with a database before they can operate. And going forward, so will we.
I thought that 5G, the cell phone technology, was starting getting our way.
Well, so this is all sort of like, this is catching us up to that. And okay. I don't even know, they don't really call the 600 megahertz stuff 5G. That's,
no, but the 5G technology is, I was reading that it might be interfering with what we're dealing with. I think that's where it was heading. The frequencies that we're going to use and some of that. I might be wrong.
No, I think, yeah, 5G is, and you know, again, I haven't really, what the carriers agree on as 5G is up in the air, but this is really about this sort of 700 megahertz and white space devices. This all came about around 2010, and then the 600 megahertz stuff is not quite considered 5G. It's like LTE advanced or something like that. Yeah. So yeah, and the thing to take away from this is that the whitespace devices have to check into a database. We will too. You know, what were in the rules with these whitespace devices is they have to pull from, they were supposed to pull from a database once a day. That's actually, in theory, gonna get quicker. And they'll check in much, much sooner. So it seems like, given the fact that there aren't that many whitespace devices out there, and that there's this more restrictive use on their application, it seems like, I feel like we can coexist with whitespace devices. This was a big boogeyman in 2010, I remember, but it's sort of faded away. So speaking of the database, Spectrum Bridge seems to be the one that's most geared towards wireless microphones. You guys should go to Spectrum Bridge's website. They do seem to, so basically the FCC, to kind of give context, they authorized a couple of different database providers. Spectrum Bridge is the most user-friendly, and I do use that term somewhat loosely for wireless microphone users. So definitely, you know, you should check it out. In the future, you will be able to, and you will be required to reserve usage in the database.
Also, it doesn't matter which database because they all update each other automatically.
That's right.
Regardless of which one you register in.
Kind of like the credit bureaus.
Yeah, and we all know how well that went last night. And that sort of catches us up to what is going on now in terms of the 600 megahertz auction incentives and repacking. Yes, Scott?
When you say register the database, is that like on a daily basis or a one-time basis?
Yeah, so this was, it's funny, last night as I was going over this, these were all the slides I took away because it's very intense. Like, originally when they were talking about it, it was like, there's going to be an event, you know, and you could register like an event around a certain facility, or you can register a facility, or you know, you're shooting on location and you get your one lines. You can go into all of those individual locations and register that. That's the sort of thing they had in mind. You know, that's, I think they realized that wireless mics for a lot of users are too sort of itinerant and you know, ad hoc to be able to do that practically, and so those rules are changing. I don't know where they stand now.
My understanding is the rule applies to unlicensed users as far as every time they plan to turn on their transmitter, before doing so must actually look at the database to make sure that the frequency that they're set to is free and clear.
And once you're licensed, then what?
It's up to you as a professional user to check as needed. But unlicensed users are actually, by law, required to do that check before operating.
Right, and unlicensed users will always be considered secondary users of that spectrum. So as a licensed user, you're considered primary or co-user.
But an event.
My question is, so if you are a licensed user, can I just say, because it is untenable the way it was described, I can't do that on a daily basis.
Nope.
So is it like, do I go on one time and say, hey, listen, for the next 6 months in the New York City area, I am going to be using this?
That they won't allow, no.
Yeah.
That would be great. But
You could, the studio could, like, you know, Silvercup or you know, any of the major studios. Tony Town would just, you know, all of Greenpoint would just be one big reserved area. But yeah, no, you in terms of like.
The network do that? Could they say, hey, listen, we're shooting the show here. We're going to occupy these frequencies for the next 10 months.
Well,
like that GPS coordinates and the dates and start and stop times and that kind of thing.
See, you can't say 6 months from midnight January 1st to, you know, midnight June 1st. It's as a license holder, you'll get some priority, and I'll talk about some of the specific channels that you'll be able to use that will be free of whitespace devices, because they're going to set aside channels. But yeah, it's a little worrisome. The one thing I would say, which I think is really important, is the rules are so convoluted for the whitespace device manufacturers that in New York City proper and in a lot of the sort of dense urban areas, there's very, very little space that they're legally allowed to operate in anyways. So I'm less concerned about whitespace devices these days. I think before when they were first being talked about and before the rules were clarified, in New York, yeah, that was a concern. Now, if you travel outside of New York into some of the more rural areas, then it might be an issue. But then there'll be more spectrum available in general.
I guess a different side of this question in general is that let's compare Rockefeller Center to Javits Center. So Rockefeller Center operates 24 hours a day as a TV center. And they would register their frequencies that are just almost never changing, right? So they sort of just take up that area. And us as a temporary coming and going, like they're always listed, but we have to check 2 days before.
Right.
And we don't even know we're going to go until midnight before. But we're supposed to, as a licensor holder, check 2 days before to see if my frequencies are okay, which is one thing with the white space, but then we also have to check with them anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. No. And I was just going to say, and to repeat the question for those watching on the internet, yeah, if you're sort of an ad hoc user, itinerant user, never in the same place twice, this is very onerous for you. And I think the FCC has addressed that. I think it's much easier if you're a facility where you can go in and register the coordinates of your facility. And that, starts to make sense. And again, in New York City, it's less worrisome because of the rules for the white space devices to operate.
And then the other half of that is, so comparing Rockefeller Center to Javits Center. So Javits Center doesn't have an established anything, and they change by their event. So they're a space, they're not an inhabited frequency user. So each event could change what they need to do. So they need to register 6 months out, hey, we plan on using.
Right, they're a venue, they're considered a venue.
They're not a Part 74 licensed entity. Javits Center. So they can't do the registering.
But oh, I see.
They don't provide the mics.
So they have to let all of the people who wander in hack it out.
No, I mean, if there's an event, it's usually known well in advance, so the producers and promoters of the event should eventually start to understand that they need to get someone with a Part 74 license to register the event. Okay, so if they're not themselves a Part 74 licensee.
So we have an audio convention there,
right?
And all of you guys show up and you have your booths. You have something going on.
Right.
You need to register that somehow.
Absolutely.
That's a pop-up,
Yes.
Jim Dugan walked in, and I don't want to single you out, but you have experience with facilities. Are white space device registrations for those facilities? Is that something that you work with them on? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to single you out, but
no, I haven't seen any white space devices at all.
Right.
And this is, all I do on a daily basis.
Right.
And at a lot of television networks. So I haven't seen any white space devices at all.
Good. Yeah. So I think for and hi. I think in terms of white space device usage, it's less of a concern now. It was a big deal in 2010, but it exists. These devices certainly have the potential to operate, but in dense urban areas, it's not too much of a concern. All right, I think we're running a little short on time, but I do think that it's important to get to the 600 megahertz repack, and I think probably the best person to explain it is John Legere. Is that how you say his name? He is the T-Mobile CEO. T-Mobile won the most amount of spectrum in this auction. And what it was a mandate by, I think it was Barack Obama who did the executive order, to create as much UHF spectrum as possible. And I think it was 500 megahertz he was looking for. And so through a complicated series of incentive auctions and reverse auctions and auctions, Those UHF stations that wanted to get off the air were encouraged to do so. And those that could move were also encouraged to do so. But the idea was to free up as much of 600 megahertz as possible. So without further delay, we'll let John explain it.
Oh man, am I excited. I just couldn't wait to tell you the latest news. And it's big news, possibly the biggest news ever for T-Mobile and Metro PCS, for our customers, and for wireless consumers everywhere. Here's the deal. The FCC just ended a successful spectrum auction, and T-Mobile cleaned up. This once-in-a-lifetime auction put incredibly valuable airwaves up for sale. Low-band spectrum, to be clear. It's the equivalent of beachfront spectrum, the stuff that works better in buildings and travels further from the tower. And you heard me right. Little old T-Mobile walked away with more than any other company. 45% of all the spectrum they auctioned. The Spectrum Motherlode. And, drum roll please, we picked up spectrum in every single inch of the United States.
Hyperbole.
Yeah, he's very excited. What's that? Only if you're a T-Mobile customer. So yeah, incentive auction. So this brings us to here, which is we've lost 700 megahertz, and now we're losing 600 megahertz, or a large chunk of it. And stations are either going to go off the air or they are going to move down. So here is what it looks like. Here's what it looks like. Some stations went off the air and the rest moved down. And it's important to know that the way these services operate, there's a downlink and an uplink. So there's a link from your handset to the base station, and then a base station back down to your handset. And so those are separated into two different bands, right? Because the link from your handset to the base station is much lower power than the link from the base station to your handset. And so those are separated into downlink and uplink. And there's two bands that are worth talking about, or three bands. One is the guard band between UHF stations and the downlink. And then there's a duplex gap, which is just a fancy way of saying the space between the downlink and the uplink. And those are divided into two sections. One set aside for licensed users, and the other for unlicensed and whitespace device users. And so when all of the smoke cleared, we lost a large portion of the band, 614 to 698, and that's going to be ending on July 13th, 2020. A lot of UHF equipment is going to have to be replaced. And really, you know, there's going to be, now is the time to start looking at that. And we'll talk about strategies in a minute. But the final deadline is July 13th, 2020. There will be pockets, the duplex gap and the guard band, but there are restrictions that'll be used, as well as restrictions placed on operating with UHF stations and around UHF stations. And it is a good time to consider alternative ranges, alternative frequency bands for wireless mic users. And again, if I haven't said it enough, and I'm going to say it a few more times, if you're eligible for a license, now is the time really to apply for one. So if we look, this is the what the UHF TV band will look like afterwards. There's public safety frequencies, which, how many people, just I'm curious, have wireless systems in, like if you're using electrosonics, block 470 or block 19? Okay. So yeah, it's you know, that is also in New York where public safety frequencies operate, and so that's, you know, a very, very careful consideration that you have to make. Well, they're not going to be. They are hard to operate in right now.
They're illegal.
Yeah, I mean, you technically should not. Yeah, I mean,
it's
by
illegal.
law, you can't operate in those bands in New York, in those channels. Sorry, in New York. Yeah. Licensed or unlicensed.
It's not all the channels in that chart
Yeah,
for every city. Each city is unique.
I'm going to go to New York, I think.
Oh, right below it shows.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Forgot my glasses. 14, 15, and 16 in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even if you own equipment that's at 470, as long as you don't operate within those frequencies,
3 channels. You're okay. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's, am I correct, that's saying that in that duplex gap you're okay to operate?
Well, so let's talk about some of the restrictions. You're going to be limited to 20 milliwatts of RF output power. And you will have to do, you'll have to, as Howard said, check the database prior to operating. Unlicensed.
By the way, that says allowed. It should say required.
Yes, yes. Required to check with the database. Unlicensed mics operating in the guard bands will need to register with the, be required to register with the database administrator.
So how's the effective radiated power measured? Is that like a certain distance from the antenna, or is it the actual rating of the device?
So that's a change. Yeah, that's been a change. Previously, it was the power output of the transmitter itself. And yeah, I don't know. The last I heard, there was still some discussion about it.
Yeah, the rules did get updated in July in relation to this. And what the FCC ended up allowing is the manufacturers to either go with the old method of measured power at the antenna port, or EIRP, which is the effective radiated power. So now either type of measurement and spec is allowed for. So it's a little more.
And that's not something they would expect an end user to do. That's something that the
no, this
manufacturer would
is
certify.
part of the certification process that the manufacturer has to go through with a laboratory that's doing the actual certification. Yes.
But 20 milliwatts EIRP is a lot friendlier than 20 milliwatts at the antenna port.
Yes, more favorable.
More favorable to us.
Now, the whitespace devices that operate in that space, they are allowed to go up to 40 milliwatts. So that's something to keep in mind.
Or fixed.
If they're portable,
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that's 40 milliwatts EIRP as well.
Yes.
Yeah. But the same restrictions, like the restrictions on the whitespace devices, haven't gotten more permissive in terms of being able to operate in urban areas. So, you know, I'm hoping we still don't see them in dense urban areas. And then Cochannel operation, which this is a Sennheiser slide, so they were sure to point out Sennheiser proposed this. Which is good. Instead of 100 kilometers away, it's a 4 kilometer contour, and that the benchmark is minus 84 dBm indoors for you to be able to operate where an existing TV station is operating.
Indoors, that's very.
And yeah, like
likely.
Indoors by a window. I mean, it's sort of, there's this gray area. But the idea is that they acknowledge that just because there's a UHF TV station on the air, number one, they're going to be operating at a lot more power than we will, and number two, so it's unlikely we would interfere with them, and that the previous restrictions were pretty onerous given that circumstance. So this is, even though it seems dire, this is an easing of the restrictions for us. And I do think it's worth mentioning, you know, we're going to talk about what stations are on the air and what's off the air as the transition happens. Just because a station, according to a database, is occupied doesn't mean that we can't operate on it. I mean, you guys in the canyons of Manhattan or inside of a studio or a building can successfully use radio mics, even though there's an existing DTV station on the air. In theory, and I know Howard's sighing because it's not, you know, again, we're talking what's permissible and what happens, how we work this on set. You know, we're pretty well shielded here in an interior like this, so that we can use that spectrum.
So that would also include all of the frequencies we've owned for a long time that are already illegal, and we still have them in our closet. It's effectively the same game.
Yeah, I would say that I have no comment about that.
No, you don't have to make a comment. It's but you know, if that's the case, then it wouldn't matter what frequency we're talking about.
The one thing I would say,
guard band.
I won't use your name when I repeat your question.
That's fine. Bob.
What this random gentleman said is that, you know, he may or may not be using wireless mics in what was you know, 700 megahertz spectrum available to us.
I'm just saying that a lot of people still, you know, we don't throw our stuff away that we spend a lot of money on. Right. So it's, you know, what do you call it, a theoretical conversation. If that equipment still exists, by this discussion, its ability to be used is no different than the new rules, because if it's already illegal by whatever the old rules were, and they've eased the new rules, and they're both capable of being used, there's really no difference what the frequency is.
Right, Ben.
Well, yes and no. If you're competing against a television station, then that's one thing. But if you're on the same frequency as a public first responder or EMS or fire, and you interfere with that operation, that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, you could get into some serious trouble for that. So, both are illegal, of course, but you're more likely to interfere with those communications than you would a TV station.
Right.
Yeah.
And Howard.
Well, and the other aspect of it, you can do that, obviously, yes. But these companies like T-Mobile, who have bid billions of dollars for the spectrum, will likely be monitoring that spectrum and will report your use at some point if you're not lucky. It's like speeding on the highway. Most of the time you get away with it, and other times you're fined. Right. So you have to understand that there's a risk to it.
Yeah, and I think in all cases, public safety don't do that.
No, agreed, but the point was brought up that it is capable of being used without interference inside buildings. So that was sort of where the discussion went.
Correct.
I'm just proposing the theoretical discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think
at that point it wouldn't matter what the frequency is.
Absolutely. Part of the challenge is going to be, you know, I have to talk about, and we have to talk about what the regulations are. Sure. And yeah, I mean, if you forgetting, you know, again, public safety off the table, but if you're interfering with the services that these companies paid so much money for, that they will come after you, particularly if you're going to be in the same place. Just from a practical point of view, though,
as they should. The
other thing is you're going to be on a show, and you're going to show up to set one day, and it could be a whole sort of like can of hurt. Mm-hmm. If four of your 8 channels,
correct,
you know, don't get more than 3 feet of range.
Yep.
So I mean, in terms of planning, it's important to plan as if that will happen.
I just wanted to talk that whole idea through. So
yeah. I want to skip ahead a little bit to the timeline. You know, obviously that animation that you saw, where the stations were like quickly gliding down. you know, there's not enough tower technicians, I don't think, to be able to do that right away. So there is a kind of timeline that's happening, and it is broken down into phases. We're phase 4 and phase 9 here in New York. Just to give you a sense of how complicated this is, because some stations need to go off the air because others are moving there, the FCC has an interactive map where you can see, like this is an example just in the Northeast of the linked stations. So what one station can do, can't do until another station does something else. And it's quite elaborate. So they're going to stick to the timeline as published as much as they can, but this is not going to happen overnight. That does not change our 2020 deadline.
Would you mind, Peter, I'm sorry, go back to that other
Sure.
slide. So is this, that's 600 megahertz?
This is the 600 megahertz transition timeline.
New York is
So what is
two
it? Yeah,
phases.
so in that phase 4, when it says August 2, what does it say? 2019?
Yeah, 2019. And all of these slides are going to be available for you to download
Great.
too.
But New York is also in a later phase, phase 9. So some of the stations will be a little later.
Yeah,
even.
I think I saw it like WNET is in phase 9. So some of the, yeah.
So each of those lines represents 1 or 2 stations at different periods in the transition?
Yeah, the bulk of the transition is
more
the
than 1 or
first,
2 in some cases, yeah.
and then it's 1 or 2, yeah, for New York at least.
But we should assume that by August 2, 2nd, 2019, that 600 megahertz is not going to be useful for us here in New York.
I think that's a good working assumption. Yes. And T-Mobile is going to be aggressive about, you know, kicking people out as best they can.
I'll show it to you a little later in my slides, but we have a spreadsheet that actually shows the dates for each station in New York, so you'll actually know which channels are going when. That chart was good, but it didn't break it down by channel. Yeah.
And they'll also be doing testing and stuff like that, so it's not.
There's usually a 2-month gap
date,
between
yeah.
the start of testing and the commencement of operations.
So to give you a sense of what New York looks like before the transition, we have, and again, this is according to the database, we have these channels here that's available for us to use. After the transition, this chunk goes away, and in theory, we have these available.
So
Yeah.
what's interesting is if you count the number of white spaces pre-transition, there were 8, and post there were 7. So it's not like a huge loss. It's a loss, of course, but not quite as bad as it could have been.
And finally, strategies going forward, again, license. Stay informed. All of these links and slides will be available to download. On a kind of just anecdotal note, you know, it's worth considering other technologies that are out there. You know, there's really interesting technologies that may not be appropriate for broadcast necessarily, but you know, there's wireless microphones that work in decked frequencies, which is 1.9 gigahertz. That's certainly appropriate for a lot of boardrooms and conference rooms. That works pretty well in my personal experience. There's other frequency bands that are opening up. You know, it's ultra wideband is one that's, I think, 6 gigahertz. Is that right, or even higher? 7, yeah. Yeah. Again, you know, those small wavelengths, not great for, you know, our use out on the street, but again, not everybody has that need. And so if we can all sort of encourage, you know, the facilities that we come into contact with, for them to consider other bands, that will free up spectrum for our use. VHF, I think VHF is really good for IFBs and comms. Electrosonics, Radioactive Designs are 2 companies that are working well in that area. Digital wireless makes really efficient use of the spectrum. wireless systems that record, where the transmitter records. That is one way to avoid issues with getting interfered with. And I think it's important to inform producers that you work with about the upcoming changes. I think that they need to be brought into the fold. It was really interesting, even like all those years ago when you and I were at the FCC in Washington, D.C., the Broadway League was right there. They were well involved with the FCC from an early stage, and I'd like to see motion picture, again, borrowing that term from the FCC, motion picture producers there as well at that table. So that relies on you having a dialogue with your producers. And then, yeah, we should just give up on wireless boom. No. All right, thank you. I've taken up way too much time. This will be available. Those are yeah, any questions. And I know that the manufacturers are also going to go into detail about this too. So thank you.